Hi, this is another episode of Talks with Professor Amber. I'm Professor Amber, and today we're going to be talking about the Civil War. Now, the Civil War in American history, it's one of the most studied and most talked about, most engaged in historical discussions of any event probably that happened in this country. And whether it was because of the overall gruesomeness of it, of how many lives were lost, the weaponry wasn't as advanced, so people who were shot by a bullet had this very slow and painful death. And those who were shot, usually the medical treatments of them as well wasn't really as advanced, so there's not a lot that they could do for someone. Whether it was that or that the country, for the first time in its history, and the only time since, was so strongly divided that it cost them to go to war. With any country, civil war is just something really horrendous, and I imagine quite terrifying for the people who are going through it. So whether it's because of the gruesomeness, the division, or what people debate all the time, what caused the Civil War, and in most arguments, they say it's slavery, the movement to abolish slavery or to keep the institution of slavery. It's a very controversial subject, at least back then it was, and it still is today. But for my discussion today, I have just a couple questions that I want to pose both to you, the students, but also just for in general to study this more in depth. One of the questions is, was slavery at the core of why the Civil War was fought? Was slavery at the core of why the Civil War was fought? And so, from reading from different primary sources, other sources that have studied extensively into this topic, my interpretation from all of this, my understanding is yes, it was slavery, but I would argue it was deeper than just slavery. I think from both sides, both the Union and the Confederacy, why the Civil War started was because there was an infringement on individuals' constitutional rights or what they thought was their constitutional right. And I believe that was truly what was the core of the Civil War. Yes, the mode and the institution of slavery was certainly it. I don't want to discredit that, but I think really from both sides we can analyze that why they thought they should have A or B was because it was an infringement on their constitutional right. And we can look at, let's say, the Union first. So those against slavery or those who are abolitionists, you can see authors like Frederick Douglass. He was an African American writer at this time, really argued that it was extremely hypocritical of the country to state in their constitution that all men were created equal, but then they still allowed the institution of slavery to continue. And so, from their perspective, to not allow African Americans the same rights that the white man had is extremely hypocritical, and they interpret it as an infringement on their constitutional rights. Uh, Looking at the Confederate side, Southern states saw the abolishment of slavery and that whole movement against slavery was a constitutional violation to their protection of property. Now, understand these are two sides with totally two different moral frameworks, but for them, slaves were property, and for the government to meddle in their protection to property was extremely against their right as an individual. And you see this in certain sentiments by like John Smith Preston in his speech at the Virginia Convention when he announced that South Carolina would be officially seceding. You can see that they believed as such that let me pull it up, the quote. Oh. He listed out in his speech, almost parallel to the Declaration of Independence, how they stated what they think their rights were and then listing out the grievances. Well, writers like John Smith Preston, or orators, I should say, like John Smith Preston, argued that all sorts of things had been happening. There's a list of grievances, but one of the grievances I want to point out was that a majority of the non-slave holding states have not only refused to carry out the provisions of the Constitution in regards to returning their slaves when they had run away across the Mason-Dixon line and all that stuff, but they refused to carry out those provisions and then the laws to protect slave property, but have made stringent laws to prevent the execution of those provisions. So not only did they interpret that the government in northern states were not only refusing to acknowledge their constitutional right to property, but were taking extreme actions to even prevent it even further. And so, from their perspective, in their moral framework, it's totally understandable why they seceded. They thought in their minds that they were doing exactly what the forefathers did to Britain, to break ties against a government that was tyrannical and not protecting their rights. So, going back to the question again, was slavery at the core of why the Civil War was fought? Yes and no. No, because I think it goes deeper, but yes, absolutely. Slavery was the core of it. And I've heard many arguments on both sides of whether slavery was the cause of the war, or whether it was, who knows what other arguments. And in my case, it's rather hard to disprove that slavery wasn't really the core of it. So the next question I want to pose, and just going deeper into analyzing the Civil War and what caused it, is analyzing the effects that slavery had on war and that war had on slavery. And so the first question is, what impact did the war have on slavery? The war have on slavery. And one illustration that I think is awesome, it's Adam Goodhart's article in the New York Times called How Slavery Really Ended in America. And he dives deep into, I guess, many primary sources to discover this information about these three young African Americans who were slaves, and they were, during the very beginning of the war, were building this battery for the Confederacy against a Union fort close by. And so these three young African American slaves decided to run away and to try and escape to this Union fort called Fort Monroe. And throughout the article, it talks about the controversialness of what to do with these African American slaves that escaped. And what ends up happening is it became a safe haven for these slaves to escape to. And through that whole process, and whether that it was legal for them to even be doing that according to the Constitution or not, it led into even more acts like the Emancipation Act with President Lincoln when he finally proclaimed that as well. So war had a huge effect on slavery, and whether it took the war to actually abolish slavery and to end slavery, who knows? But with our history and with the history of the Civil War, I would definitely conclude that that's what helped do it. And then vice versa, let's look at the impact that slavery had on the war. And with war in general, it's vastly complicated. It's hard to discuss just from a moral perspective. How could we justify going to war? So there's already all these complicated things surrounding this topic. But slavery, I feel like in this war, the Civil War, made it even more complicated than it even is without it. So with previous laws that had been set in place, when they came across runaway slaves, by law, they were supposed to return them as they viewed it as property, not as humans. And so with the secession of some of the southern states, did they still face that issue? I mean, legally and constitutionally, did they have any obligations to the states that decided to secede and actually declare themselves enemies of the Union? And so when these African American slaves, the ones that we just discussed earlier in Adam Goodhart's article, the general at that time, Butler, he was actually a lawyer before then, and he looked into great detail. And because they were at wartime, they actually had legal action to not return them. They considered them in the articles contrabands. And so that probably just fueled the fire even more, with division against the southern states and northern states as well. And we also see that these former slaves who ran away to these forts, these Union forts, they were kind of given an ultimatum, like, you're either going to help us so then we can justify feeding and housing you, or you're going to go back. And so you see a lot of them that started helping during wartime, and with soldiers who were having to go out and fight, but also perform these other duties as well, such as cleaning, cooking, doing all this stuff, doing medical stuff as well. With having these African American, I guess now freed slaves, freed up these soldiers from not having to fight and do all these other duties. And over and over again, especially in that same article, they talk about the Union soldiers and the generals found that these black people, men, women, children, were actually happy and eager to help. And they slowly began to humanize them more once they had more interaction with them. And so the war had just this profound impact on slavery. But that is all for my discussion today. I hope that I was able to help enlighten on the topic, and until next time.